Hello BookTube, welcome to another video. Today I'm doing the classic and contemporary pairs tag, which was created by Jennifer from Insert Literary Pun here, and I was kindly tagged by Leah from Hyde and Seek. And I'll post the respective videos in the doobly-doo, and do please go and check them out because they were really wonderful, lots of interesting things to say. So the idea behind this tag is that you kind of suggest a pairing of classic book and a contemporary book. And I have 4 of those to suggest to you today. Some of the books I have here, and I'll show the physical book, and for other books I don't have them here, but I've read them at some point in the past, and I'll, through the magic of editing, make the covers appear. So the first pairing I want to start with is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, and A Gentleman in Moscow by Emmer Tolls, I think pronunciation is. So both are obviously set in Russia. Both are historical fiction, although of course War and Peace is also more generally regarded as a classic, but within that I'd argue it's historical fiction. But beyond that there are some interesting kind of thematic similarities. So people often talk about literature, being in conversation with each other, and of course there's sometimes clear references in the text, and definitely in A Gentleman in Moscow there are references to War and Peace. But I think beyond that, there's more, beyond just those references, there's more conversation happening. So War and Peace tells the story of quite a large number of characters, mainly from the Russian nobility, during the wars with Napoleon in the first decade or two of the 19th century, and how the wars and peace that was in between and after the wars kind of influenced the lives of all these people, and you get all kinds of different perspectives. And it's been a while since I read it. I couldn't give you a plot synopsis, it's a huge brick of a novel anyway, but I can highly encourage you to read it. There's lots of beautiful stuff going in there, and one of these days, if I had infinite time, I definitely should reread it again. And then on the other hand, there's A Gentleman in Moscow, which is written 2016, I think, not that long ago, set in the first half of last century, so 20th century, and it deals with also a Russian nobleman, a count, who is confined to house arrest in a hotel in Moscow after the Russian Revolution, basically just for being a member of the nobility, and therefore a capitalist and an oppressor and an enemy of the people. And we follow his life through the following decades as he is confined in this hotel. Now there are a lot of call-outs and references to classical Russian literature in A Gentleman in Moscow, because the Count, as a well-educated man, a well-read man, knows his Russian classics, of course. He's of course quite proud of them. But the interesting contrast is and so therefore he also references War and Peace occasionally. I think there are 2 explicit references in the text. But the interesting contrast is the themes. So in War and Peace, kind of the overarching theme is the powerlessness of people to control historical events and to kind of control their own fate. They're just kind of swept along by history, by these tides, by these occurrences. So wars happen, peace happens. Even the outcome of the war, people have little influence on. This is a whole section on the Battle of, I think, Borodino, where basically Tolstoy is praising the Russian general for realizing that there's nothing much he can do to influence the outcome. He just, kind of has to let it happen. And there's also an explicit section where the narrator, so therefore probably Tolstoy himself, kind of unfolds a theory of how history works. And basically people get swept along by the events, and there's very little they can do about it themselves. And kind of Gentleman in Moscow examines opposite. So although the Count can't prevent himself being sentenced to house arrest and can't leave this hotel that he's confined to, I mean in principle he could, but he'd probably be arrested and sent to Siberia or worse, so in that sense he can't leave. But then the novel explores kind of the autonomy he has and the power he has to deal with his situation, to master his circumstances, and to within the confines that are set by external forces, still shape his own life and his own existence. And kind of, in that way, refutes part of what War and Peace is saying. So, although there are things the Count can't control, there's still very much, A Gentleman in Moscow says, there's still very much things the Count can control, and therefore he still has power to shape his narrative. Also an interesting point is that, spoiler alert, the Second World War happens during this book, but it's almost completely skimmed over, where War and Peace, kind of the point is that the war has a huge influence on the characters' lives. The war, even though it's the Second World War, which is a hugely devastating event, and the Germans got quite close to Moscow, the war seems to have relatively little effect on the characters in this book. So it's kind of an interesting contrast. Then the second pairing I have is Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist, or really any other Dickens, and Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers. Now, for both of those, it's a long time since I read them, but I think there's a very strong and interesting thematic connection again. So Dickens, of course, wrote fiction. Oliver Twist is a very well-known work. David Copperfield is kind of in the same vein. They're both about young orphans who have to make their way in life and have various misfortunes and misadventures, but then eventually come into their own. I think, if I remember correctly, Oliver Twist turns out to be the long-lost son of a rich person, is therefore kind of readopted or found again, and eventually makes his fortune. And then David Copperfield manages to kind of work his own way up the ladder of life and social success. Whereas, and that's all fiction, but based on Dickens's time researching in London amongst the poor people, the lower classes. And on the other hand, Beyond the Beautiful Forevers is the story of people living in the slums of Mumbai in India, written by Catherine Boo, an American journalist who spent 3 years there doing research. And it's cast as non-fiction, but you follow a number of characters, and I forget if they are real or if they are composite characters. But shows very much their life, and unlike Dickens, she's not constrained by kind of narrative formalism, so she doesn't have to have this happy ending through, lucky inheritances and things like that, but really shows you what life in India is like. And I think that makes it an interesting connection. So in both cases, these are people showing what life is like for the less fortunate in society. In both cases, I think you, of course, can criticize the fact that it is an outsider telling us about these people. These people aren't given their own voice as such, so they're all filtered through the writings of these outsiders, as it were, of these more fortunate people in society. And I think it's a very valid criticism, but at the same time, it's possibly better than not giving a voice at all to these people. And I think hopefully if the research is done well and carefully, it can still be a way of giving a voice, of making people realize that there are things going on in our societies that we need to change. And of course, ideally, we should be hearing that from the people most directly affected. But it was also interesting, what I was thinking about is, so Dickens, in part of the point of his writing was to kind of show people what was going on with the less fortunate, make them aware, and perhaps generate some social change. I was trying to think if there are any writers kind of doing the same thing these days. So there's lots of people writing about, but there are quite some writers writing about racial oppression or oppression other marginalized groups in our societies face, and that's very important, but I can't think of anyone who's really focusing on kind of the plight of people who are poor as such, right? So and not oppressed or marginalized for other reasons. And yeah, so we have, for example, Catherine Boo and perhaps some other non-fiction works, but I can't think of anybody well known that's using fiction to kind of do the same thing. So we had, of course, Dickens. Steinbeck does something similar in his books, or at least in The Grapes of Wrath, which is the only one of his I've read. But that seems to have gone away a bit in the modern writing tradition. So yeah, I wonder if that's just the fact that I'm not aware, or whether there are other reasons for that. Please do leave me your thoughts down below. And I shall move on to the third pairing. These two. So we have the Vinland Sagas by an anonymous author, and The Far Traveller Voyages of a Viking Woman by Nancy Marie Brown. And I've talked already about this book, especially in my non-fiction November video, which came out in definitely not November. But yeah, I think they're a very nice pairing to read together. So the Vinland Sagas is a collection of two Icelandic sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eirik the Red. And the Icelandic sagas themselves is a collection of writings. They weren't bundled as such when they were written, but they're now kind of known as a genre of writing as the Icelandic sagas. So they were written in Iceland in kind of the late Middle Ages, around the 1400s, if I'm not mistaken, perhaps 1200s. And they all deal with stories of Vikings, or what we're going to call Vikings, so people living in Nordic countries and in Scandinavia in the early Middle Ages. So around about the year 1000 or earlier. These two sagas is around the year 1000. So there's quite some debate as to how to characterize these stories, or these works. So some people say we should regard them just as kind of fantasy or mythology, and there are a number of stories that have supernatural elements, supernatural occurrences. In these sagas there's at one point there's some soothsaying and prophecy and dead people coming back to life, which obviously would qualify to say fantasy or supernatural. There are also people who say we should kind of more regard it as historical fiction, in the sense that they are about people who are probably real, but who existed or lived several centuries before the sagas were written. And there's some people who see it as an accurate recording of oral histories, and therefore it's kind of almost a work of non-fiction. I think possibly per saga you could argue differently. Yeah, so in these two sagas are bundled together as the Vinland Sagas, because they both deal, amongst other things, with voyages made by a number of Vikings to a place that they call Vinland, and which we now know as Newfoundland in northeastern Canada. And we have, for a long time, people weren't quite sure whether Vinland was, and there were lots of arguments about it and whether it was real at all or not and completely made up. But we have, in fact, now archaeological evidence that shows there was indeed, very briefly, but for some years at least, some form of Viking settlement in northeastern Canada, around about the time where the saga was set. And then related to that, so we have this non-fiction book, The Far Traveller Voyages of a Viking Woman, and that is about Gudrid the Far-Travelled, who's one of the characters mentioned in the Vinland Sagas, and it's especially about Nancy Marie Brown's quest to find out as much as possible about this woman. So, especially for the first half of the book, Gudrid kind of disappears, and it's really about finding out about Vikings' everyday life and what the archaeological evidence is, and it therefore paints a very nice picture of kind of Viking life as a whole, not just kind of the raiding and plundering part that we all know about, but more general what life was like on a Viking farm, how hard life was in Iceland, which is a place without many natural resources, and paints a very vivid picture of Viking society as a whole. And yeah, of Gudrid herself a bit less, because there just isn't that much known about her, and occasionally Brown kind of stretches the archaeological evidence maybe slightly more than is justified, but on the whole it's a very fascinating read, and I think pairs very nicely with the saga. Another pairing, especially if you get this edition of the sagas, is that here in the back there are some useful maps and stuff, and also some drawings, for example, of Viking ships, which this book is missing. So if you read a description of a Viking ship in the Far Traveler, then you can look up in the appendix of the Vinland Sagas what the ship looked like. So they made a very useful addition to me, and it kind of pairs neatly together. So all the documentary evidence we have about Gudrid, more or less, and then supplemented by archaeological evidence and some imaginings to really paint a fuller picture of what her life would have been like. And then the final two novels, I'm going to promote some Dutch literature. Those are Louis Couperus's De Stille Kracht, translated into English as The Hidden Force, and Hella S. Haas's De Heren van de Thee, translated to The Tea Lords. So both of these are novels set in Indonesia. They're written about 90 odd years apart. So Louis Couperus's novel came out in 1900, if I'm not mistaken, and Hella Haas's came out in the 90s. And both deal with a Dutch family going to Indonesia, and also therefore with colonialism, because Indonesia was a Dutch colony at the time. Well, at least at the time that Louis Couperus was writing. By Hella Haas's time, of course, become independent. But Hella Haas's work is a historical novel, and the interesting thing is that she acquired, with proper permission, the archives of this Dutch family that had lived, or at least members of the family had lived in Indonesia, quite a lot of members of that family in fact, and she was allowed access to their archives, to various letters and other writings, and then based on that she wrote this novel about two members in particular of that family, one a husband and wife and their children. So it's kind of interesting. So we have two different takes, one written at the time that Indonesia was still a Dutch colony, although quite critical of colonialism, and one written as a historical novel later. And so the Lords of the Tea, the Heren van de Thee, is kind of a very interesting project. Just the idea of taking real writings and then fictionalizing it into a novel, and blurring the boundaries of what is fiction, what is non-fiction. In that way, also kind of connects also to Beyond the Beautiful Forevers, which is also in principle a non-fiction book, but written in a way that could almost be a novel if you didn't know that these characters were based on real people. But then of course, Hella Haas's book was historical fiction. So De Stille Kracht by Louis Couperus I read in senior school a long time ago, and I remember not too much what the plot's about, but one thing I remember quite clearly is we had to write a book report on it, and the topic of that book report was the use of landscape and background scenery descriptions in writing. So we had to take a scene from a book we'd read where the landscape or the setting was described, and then we had to show how that connected to the story. And at the time, there was look for symbols, etc. And at the time, I had this idea that symbology was about authorial intent, right? So that things you found in the text, that finding things in the text was kind of this game where authors had hidden things and it was up to you to discover them. And then of course that can turn into kind of nonsense, because you can read all kinds of things in the text and think, the author never intended that, why are we trying to find this? So I remember for the book report there's a scene which kind of describes a beach, and there's like one paragraph, we think it's at night and the character's on this beach and sees waves rolling in, etc. And I wrote the whole section and kind of just made up any way I could find to connect the scene to the text, and every kind of symbolism. So there's like 3 waves that roll onto the beach, and if you look at the plot, the hidden force refers to kind of, at least in one reading, a kind of mystical power that connects the land of Indonesia to kind of Indonesians and pushes out the Europeans, or tries to push out the Europeans and tries to corrupt them. And that kind of comes in 3 waves as well. If you follow the plot, you say, well, these 3 waves that the character sees rolling onto the beach are symbolic of those 3 waves in the plot. And went on in that vein, and I thought, yeah, this is all nonsense, sure, I can kind of read this into it if I really want to make it all up. And then I got the book report back, and I got a 10 out of 10. And the teacher, I think, even remarked something like, oh, I wish all book reports were like this. And at the time I thought, what a load of nonsense, because I just all, made all this up. And then later in life, what someone kind of explained to me, I think I read it on internet forums, so it wasn't even directed to me once, but some kind of made a comment that recontextualized all that, said, you're looking for interpretations and things in the text. It's not about a treasure hunt finding what the author put there, it's about what you as a reader get out of the text. And as long as you can get something out of the text that you can back up with stuff you find in the text, that as long as you have textual evidence, that is a valid interpretation. And whether the author intended that or not, can be an interesting question in its own right. But even if the author didn't intend something to be there, you still found it. It still meant something to you, and that is absolutely valid. And kind of thinking back on that kind of made me shift how I thought about the book report, and I realized that, whether Couperus planned things out and put all this into that scene or not, I found it, and it's, looking back on it now, does add kind of meaning to that scene and how I read it, even if I didn't read it. So I'm not entirely sure what happened there, but I'm back. Anyway, I was about to say, so those were my picks for the Classics and Contemporaries tag. I hope you enjoyed them. If you have any thoughts about these books or other kind of books you think would pair well with them, do leave me a comment down below. If you think this is an interesting tag to do yourself, then please do so. I had a lot of fun. I hope you will as well, and I look forward to seeing more iterations of this tag. Thanks again to Leah for tagging me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you all soon. Bye bye.